If you enjoy these deep dives into the shadowed history of the Cold War and the untold stories from behind the Iron Curtain, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these files from the archives of history. To understand the tragedy of the Volkov family, one must first understand the architecture of silence that defined Moscow in the winter of 1983. It was a time of heightened paranoia. Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB, was the general secretary. The war in Afghanistan was dragging into a bloody stalemate, and relations with the West were at their frostiest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The atmosphere in the capital was not one of revolutionary fervor, but of a heavy, gray watchfulness. Oleg Volkov lived on the 5th floor of a sprawling apartment complex on Leninsky Prospect. It was a prestigious address, the kind reserved for those who had served the state with distinction, or at least with enough bureaucratic competence to be noticed. Oleg was 52 years old, a senior actuary within the Ministry of Heavy Industry. He was a man of numbers, of columns and rows, a man who believed that the world could be organized into neat, predictable patterns. His wife, Raisa, was a librarian at the State Archives. She was a woman of sharp features and even sharper anxieties, her life spent categorizing the approved history of the Soviet Union, while quietly ignoring the parts that had been erased. They were, by all accounts, the perfect Soviet couple. They had no children, a source of private sorrow that they had converted into public devotion to the party. They attended every block meeting. They volunteered for the Saturday Subbotniks to clean the streets. They kept their heads down. But inside apartment 5B, a rot was setting in, a paranoia fed by the thinness of the walls and the silence of the era. The trouble began on the evening of November 14, 1983. The heating system in the building had been rattling for weeks, a rhythmic clanking that echoed through the radiator pipes. But on this specific night, Oleg Volkov was not listening to the heat. He was sitting in his armchair, a glass of lukewarm tea in his hand, listening to the apartment next door, apartment 5C. The neighbors were new. They had moved in 3 months prior. Their names were Alexei and Tatiana Sokolov. Alexei was a physicist at a research institute. Tatiana was a translator of technical manuals. They were younger than the Volkovs, vibrant in a way that seemed almost suspicious in the dour climate of 1983 Moscow. They played music, not the patriotic anthem sanctioned by the state, but complex instrumental pieces, jazz, sometimes classical. On that night, the music had stopped. Through the shared wall of the living room, Oleg heard a series of sounds. They were rhythmic, deliberate. A tap, a pause, a scratch, then silence, then 3 rapid taps. Oleg set his tea down. The liquid rippled in the glass. He leaned his head closer to the floral wallpaper that covered the concrete partition. He held his breath. Tap, tap, scratch. It didn't sound like home improvement. It didn't sound like domestic life. To Oleg's ear, trained for decades to look for discrepancies in industrial output figures, it sounded like data. It sounded like a transmission. He stood up and walked to the kitchen where Raisa was drying dishes. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a pallid glow on her face. "Do you hear them?" Oleg asked, his voice low. Raisa paused, a plate suspended in her hand. "The Sokolovs? They are quiet tonight. No jazz. Not the music," Oleg hissed. "The wall. Come listen." Reluctantly, Raisa followed him. She pressed her ear against the cold plaster. For a long minute, there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator. Then it came again. Tap, tap, scratch, tap. Raisa pulled back, frowning. "It is the pipes, Oleg, or perhaps mice." "Mice do not scratch in rhythm, Raisa," Oleg whispered, his eyes wide. "That is not a random sound. That is a code." "A code?" Raisa looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and fear. "Don't be foolish. Alexei is a scientist. Maybe he is working." "Exactly," Oleg said, pacing the small room. "He is a physicist. He works at the Kurchatov Institute. Do you know what they do there? Nuclear research, state secrets. And his wife? A translator. She speaks English, French, German. They have access, Raisa. They have access to things we cannot even imagine." "Access does not make them traitors," Raisa said, though her voice wavered. The seed had been planted. In the Soviet Union of 1983, the accusation of treason was a ghost that lived in every room. To deny the possibility was, in itself, a form of negligence. "I'm going to keep a log," Oleg announced, grabbing a notebook from his desk. "I will write down every sound, every sequence. If they are sending messages, we will know." This was the beginning. In that moment, the Volkovs ceased to be neighbors and became self-appointed sentinels. They did not know that they were embarking on a path that would lead to the destruction of 4 lives. They believed they were protecting the motherland, but in reality, they were descending into a madness of their own making. Chapter 2. The Targets Next Door. To understand why the Volkovs fixated on the Sokolovs, we must look at who Alexei and Tatiana were. In the gray uniformity of the Brezhnev and Andropov eras, the Sokolovs were splashes of color. Alexei Sokolov, 34 years old, was part of the new generation of Soviet intelligentsia. He was brilliant, a man who saw the beauty in equations and the poetry in physics. He had traveled once to East Germany for a conference, a privilege that Oleg Volkov had never been granted. Tatiana was 31. She had a laugh that carried through the ventilation shafts, a sound that Oleg found personally offensive in its freedom. She wore scarves made of foreign silk, likely gifts from her husband's travels or obtained through the black market networks that everyone knew existed but no one discussed. They had a daughter, crying occasionally in the night, but she was staying with her grandmother in the countryside for the winter, leaving the couple alone in apartment 5C. The Volkovs viewed the Sokolovs not with curiosity, but with a deep, corrosive envy masquerading as ideological purity. Why did Alexei have a car, a battered but functional Zhiguli, while Oleg took the metro? Why did Tatiana smell of French perfume? In the warped logic of the surveillance state, these were not signs of success. They were indicators of corruption. And corruption was the gateway to treason. For the next 2 weeks, Oleg Volkov barely slept. He moved his armchair permanently against the shared wall. He bought a stethoscope, claiming to the pharmacist that he needed it to monitor his own heart rate. Night after night, he sat in the dark, the earpieces dug into his ears, the chest piece pressed against the wallpaper. He began to discern patterns where none existed. November 18th, 20 Fern hours. 3 thuds, a dragging sound. Interpretation, moving equipment, possibly a transmitter. November 20th, 23:15 hours. Voices raised, then sudden silence. Interpretation, an argument about protocol. Or perhaps they realized they were being monitored. November 22nd, 02 hours. The rhythmic tapping returns. Sequence, long, short, short, long. Oleg filled 3 notebooks with these observations. He began to take them to work, analyzing the intervals between the sounds during his lunch breaks. He applied statistical regression analysis to the thuds of furniture and the creaking of floorboards. He was looking for the CIA's signature, convinced that the apartment 5C was a node in a spy ring. Raisa, initially skeptical, was slowly pulled into his orbit. Oleg played on her fears. He reminded her of the stories she cataloged at the archives, stories of saboteurs, of Western agents who infiltrated the highest levels of society. "Think about where she works, Raisa," Oleg told her over a dinner of boiled potatoes. "She translates technical manuals. Manuals for what? Machinery? Weapons systems? And she does this work at home sometimes. I have seen her carrying the satchels." "Everyone brings work home," Raisa said, but she was looking at the wall now too. "And the radio," Oleg pressed. "You hear it? They play that jazz music. But sometimes beneath the music, don't you hear the static, the interference? It's not just poor reception, it's a carrier wave. They use the music to mask the transmission." Raisa began to watch Tatiana in the hallway. She noted the times Tatiana left the apartment. She noted that Tatiana often carried a large leather tote bag. One afternoon, Raisa saw Tatiana drop an envelope in the mailbox in the lobby. It was a standard blue envelope, typical for domestic mail. But to Raisa, infected by Oleg's fever, the simple act of mailing a letter became a clandestine drop. She looked around before she dropped it. Raisa reported to Oleg that evening. She was nervous. "Who was it addressed to?" Oleg demanded. "I couldn't see, but it was thick. Too thick for a letter." "Microfilm," Oleg said with certainty. "Or encryption keys." The delusion was becoming a shared reality. In psychology, this is known as folie à deux, a shared psychosis. The Volkovs were feeding off each other's anxieties, validating each other's hallucinations until the harmless lives of their neighbors transformed into a sinister plot against the state. The Sokolovs were no longer people. They were targets. And the Volkovs were no longer neighbors. They were the first line of defense. Chapter 3. The Cipher in the Static. By early December, the obsession had consumed Oleg's life. His work at the ministry began to suffer. He made errors in his actuarial tables. He snapped at colleagues. He was living for the night, for the hours he spent pressed against the wall. He became convinced that the code he was hearing was a variation of a book cipher. He believed the tapping corresponded to page numbers and line numbers. But which book? He spent hours in the local library searching for the key. He analyzed the books he had seen Tatiana carrying, novels by Bulgakov, poetry by Akhmatova. He bought copies of them and spent manic nights trying to correlate the taps on the wall to the words on the pages. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered one night, surrounded by open books. The sequence: 4, 12, 1, the, winter, sun. It's gibberish. Maybe it's not a book, Raisa suggested. She was sewing in the corner, her eyes dark with lack of sleep. Maybe it is numbers. Coordinates. Oleg froze. Coordinates. He went back to his logbook. He looked at the sequence from the previous night. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. He looked at the next line. He grabbed a map of Moscow. He grabbed a map of the Soviet Union. He began plotting the numbers. They led nowhere. They pointed to the middle of the ocean or the center of the Kremlin. "It is encrypted," Oleg said, rubbing his face. "Of course it is encrypted. They are professionals. They wouldn't send raw coordinates." He needed to break the encryption. He needed the key. And he became convinced that the key was inside apartment 5C. "We need to get inside," Oleg told Raisa. "We cannot just break in, Oleg. That is a crime." "It is not a crime if we are exposing traitors," Oleg argued. "It is a duty. Article 64, treason against the motherland. Every citizen is obligated to report. But if we report now, without proof, the KGB might just laugh at us. Or worse, investigate us for making false accusations. We need the proof." The opportunity arose on December 10th. Alexei Sokolov knocked on their door. Oleg opened it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected a confrontation. He expected a gun. Instead, Alexei was holding a cup. He smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "Good evening, Oleg Ivanovich," Alexei said. "I apologize for the intrusion. We seem to be out of sugar, and Tatiana is baking a cake. Could we borrow a cup?" Oleg stared at him. The enemy was at the gate asking for sugar. It was a disguise, he thought, a test. "Of course," Oleg said, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. "One moment." He went to the kitchen. Raisa was standing there, pale. "He is here," she whispered. "Get the sugar," Oleg commanded. While Raisa filled the cup, Oleg returned to the door. He tried to look past Alexei into the apartment. He saw the hallway. He saw a coat rack. And there, on the small telephone table, he saw a notepad. There was writing on it. Oleg squinted. He couldn't read the words, but he saw numbers. A column of numbers. Raisa brought the sugar. Alexei thanked them profusely. "You must come over for tea sometime," he said. "We have been terrible neighbors, so busy with work. But we should celebrate the holidays together." "That would be delightful," Oleg said. As soon as the door closed, Oleg turned to Raisa. "Did you see it, the notepad?" "I saw a pad. It had the numbers, Raisa, the same numbers I heard on the wall. I am sure of it. That is the transmission log. We have to get that notepad." The invitation for tea was the opening they needed. The Volkovs didn't see it as a social gesture. They saw it as an infiltration mission. They would go into the enemy's lair. They would find the evidence. And then, they would be the heroes who saved Moscow from a CIA plot. Chapter 4. Into the Lion's Den. The dinner was set for Saturday, December 17th. The Volkovs spent the week preparing, not for a meal, but for an operation. Oleg rehearsed conversation topics that might trap the Sokolovs into revealing their allegiances. Raisa practiced sleight of hand, learning how to knock over a purse or a glass to create a distraction. They dressed in their best clothes. Oleg wore his dark suit, the one he wore for ministry reviews. Raisa wore a burgundy dress that smelled faintly of mothballs. They walked the 3 meters from their door to apartment 5C as if they were crossing a minefield. Tatiana opened the door. She was radiant, wearing a blue dress. The apartment smelled of roasted chicken and dill. Jazz was playing softly in the background. Miles Davis, Oleg noted with disgust. American music. "Welcome, welcome," Alexei boomed, ushering them in. The apartment was a shock to the Volkovs. It was the exact same layout as their own, but it felt like a different world. Where the Volkovs had heavy, dark furniture and thick drapes, the Sokolovs had open shelves filled with books, colorful rugs, and abstract art on the walls. To Oleg, the chaos of the decor was further proof of their subversive minds. They sat at the small dining table. The conversation started awkwardly. They talked about the weather, about the shortages of fresh vegetables, about the bus routes. "So, Alexei," Oleg said, taking a sip of vodka, "your work at the Institute, it must be very demanding." "It has its moments," Alexei said, serving the chicken. "Physics is a jealous mistress, but it is rewarding." "And secret?" Oleg pressed. "You work on classified projects?" Alexei laughed. "In the Soviet Union, Oleg, the menu at the cafeteria is classified. But yes, some of my work is sensitive. I study wave propagation, how energy moves through matter." Oleg's eyes met Raisa's. Wave propagation. Radio waves, transmission signals. It was a confession, veiled in scientific jargon. "And you, Tatiana?" Raisa asked, her voice tight. "You translate manuals?" "Yes," Tatiana said. "Mostly for agricultural equipment lately. Very boring. Tractors and harvesters." "But you speak English?" Oleg asked. "Yes, and French. Why learn the language of the enemy if you are only translating tractor manuals?" Oleg asked. The question was too sharp, too aggressive for a dinner party. The table went quiet. Alexei put down his fork. "The language of Shakespeare and Hemingway is not the enemy, Oleg Ivanovich. Governments are enemies. Languages are bridges." "A bridge can be crossed by an invading army," Oleg retorted. Alexei chuckled, diffusing the tension. "You are a patriot, Oleg. I respect that. Let us drink to patriotism and to peace." They clinked glasses, but Oleg did not drink to peace. He drank to the mission. Halfway through the meal, Oleg signaled Raisa. She accidentally knocked her fork off the table. As she bent down to retrieve it, Oleg stood up. "Excuse me," he said. "The restroom?" "Down the hall on the left," Alexei said. Oleg walked into the hallway. He passed the bathroom door. He went straight to the telephone table he had seen days earlier. The notepad was there. His hands were shaking. He flipped open the cover. It was a list. 300 green flour, 4 eggs, butter, 17 no. Dr. Novikov, 55, 32 Tower 12. Oleg stared at it. A grocery list, an appointment, a phone number. But then he flipped the page. On the second page, there were no words. Just rows of numbers. 4, 12, 88, 9, 21, 04, 1, 1, 1. And below that, a sketch, a diagram of a box with an antenna. Oleg tore the page from the pad, folded it, and shoved it into his pocket. He flushed the toilet to maintain the ruse and returned to the table, his heart pounding so hard he thought the Sokolovs would hear it over the jazz. He had it. He had the code. He had the schematic of the transmitter. He sat down, his face pale. "Are you all right, Oleg?" Tatiana asked. "I am fine," Oleg said, staring at Alexei. "I am just realizing something." "What is that?" "That we live very close to each other," Oleg said. "But we live in different worlds." Chapter 5. The Interpretation of Nothing. That night, back in apartment 5B, Oleg and Raisa examined the stolen page like archaeologists studying a holy relic. "Look at this," Oleg said, pointing to the sketch. "It is a radio transmitter, a shortwave burst transmitter, the kind spies use to send compressed data to satellites or listening posts." "And the numbers?" Raisa asked. "Coordinates? Frequencies?" Or maybe dates, Oleg muttered. 4/12/88, April 12th? No, the year is wrong. Wait. He ran to his bookshelf and pulled out a technical manual on radio frequencies he had stolen from the ministry library years ago. If these are frequencies, 4.12 mHz, that is a shortwave band, used for international broadcasting, Voice of America, BBC, or CIA-encoded channels. The confirmation bias was absolute. Every piece of data, no matter how innocuous, was twisted to fit the narrative. The sketch was actually a rough drawing of a birdhouse Alexei was planning to build for his mother's dacha, a simple box with a perch, the antenna. The numbers were dimensions in centimeters. But to Oleg, in the grip of his hysteria, it was the smoking gun. They are planning a broadcast, Oleg said. Soon, maybe tonight. We must call the KGB, Raisa said. We have the proof now. Oleg hesitated. This was the turning point. In the Soviet system, denunciation was a powerful weapon, but it was also a double-edged sword. If he called the KGB and handed them a grocery list and a sketch of a birdhouse, and they decided it was nothing, Oleg would look like a fool, a hysterical old man. He might be demoted, he might lose his pension. And there was another fear. What if the Sokolovs had someone on the inside? What if they were double agents? If Oleg reported them to the wrong person, he could be the one who disappeared. No, Oleg said slowly. Not yet. We need to catch them in the act. We need to catch them transmitting. Then, we call the authorities. We hand them the spies and the equipment together. We will be heroes, Raisa. Indisputable heroes. For the next 3 days, the surveillance intensified. Oleg stopped going to work. He called in sick, feigning a severe flu. He sat by the wall, recording every sound. On December 20th, the Sokolovs had an argument. The Volkovs heard shouting. I can't do this anymore, Alexei. Tatiana's voice came through the wall, muffled but audible. It's too dangerous. We have to finish it, Alexei replied. We are so close, just a few more days. What if they find out? They won't. We are careful. Oleg gripped Raisa's arm. Did you hear that? It's too dangerous. What if they find out? They are talking about the operation. In reality, the Sokolovs were arguing about a renovation. They were planning to tear down a partition wall to expand the nursery for their daughter's return. It was illegal to modify the apartment without a permit, hence the danger and the fear of being found out. But the Volkovs didn't know about the nursery. They only knew about the code. They are going to do something big, Oleg said. A few more days. Maybe Christmas. Westerners love to strike on holidays. The pressure in Oleg's mind was reaching a critical mass. He felt the weight of the entire Cold War on his shoulders. He believed that inside Apartment 5C, a blow against the Soviet Union was being prepared, and he was the only man standing in its way. Chapter 6. The fracture. The psychological toll of the vigil was breaking Raisa. She started seeing enemies everywhere. The milkman, the woman at the bus stop. She stopped eating. We have to stop them, Oleg. She wept on the night of December 21st. I cannot live like this. I can hear the tapping in my head even when it stops. We will stop them, Oleg promised. I have a plan. Oleg's plan was not one of law, but of desperation. He had decided that he could not rely on the slow, bureaucratic machinery of the state. He had to act as an agent of the state himself. He went to his closet and dug out an old service pistol. It was a Tokarev TT-33, a relic from his father's time in the war. He had never fired it. It had been wrapped in an oilcloth for 30 years, hidden in a box of winter boots. It was illegal for him to have it. He checked the magazine. 7 rounds. Oleg, what are you doing? Raisa gasped when she saw the weapon. I am preparing for a citizen's arrest, Oleg said calmly. If they try to transmit, I will enter the apartment. I will hold them at gunpoint. I will force them to confess. And then, while I hold them, you will call the militia. You are going to kill them? No. I am going to neutralize the threat. I am going to do what needs to be done. The gun lay on the table between them like a totem. It changed the energy in the room. It shifted the fantasy of spy hunting into the reality of potential violence. On December 23rd, the noise next door changed. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was drilling. Loud, grinding mechanical sounds. "They are installing the heavy equipment," Oleg shouted over the noise. "They are drilling through the walls to run the cables." In reality, Alexei had begun the renovation work, drilling holes for the new shelving. Oleg grabbed the pistol. "This is it. They are setting up the uplink." "Oleg, wait!" Raisa cried. "Wait for what? For the missiles to fall? For the secrets to be sold?" "No." He marched to the door. He was no longer an actuary. He was a soldier on the front line of an invisible war. He opened his door and stepped into the hallway. He stood in front of apartment 5C. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He waited. He listened to the drill wind down. He heard Alexei's voice. "That looks good. Pass me the anchor." Oleg took a deep breath. He convinced himself that he was about to save his country. He convinced himself that the neighbors he had shared tea with were monsters. He raised his hand to pound on the door. But just as his fist was about to strike the wood, the door opened. Alexei stood there, covered in plaster dust, holding a drill. He looked surprised to see Oleg standing there, red-faced and trembling. "Oleg Ivanovich?" Alexei asked. "Is the noise too much?" "We are sorry, we are just finishing." Oleg looked at the drill. He looked at Alexei. He looked past him into the apartment, searching for the transmitter. "Where is it?" Oleg demanded, his voice shaking. "Where is what?" "The machine. The code." "I know what you are doing, Sokolov. I know everything." Alexei lowered the drill, confused. "Oleg, are you drunk? What are you talking about?" "Don't play the innocent with me," Oleg screamed. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull the gun yet. He pulled out the stolen page from the notepad. "I have the proof, the frequencies, the diagram." Alexei squinted at the paper in Oleg's shaking hand. Then his expression shifted from confusion to a strange, pitying realization. "Oleg, that is the design for a birdhouse. And those numbers, those are lumber dimensions." "Liar!" Oleg shrieked. "Lies! It is a CIA code." Doors in the hallway began to crack open. Other neighbors were peeking out. The situation was spiraling. Oleg felt the eyes on him. He felt the humiliation rising. He had to be right. He had to be right, because if he was wrong, he was insane. "I am calling the authorities," Oleg yelled. "Go ahead," Alexei said, his voice hardening. "Call them. Show them your proof. And I will show them the hole in the wall where the shelf is going. Go home, Oleg. You are making a scene." Alexei stepped back and slammed the door in Oleg's face. The lock clicked. Oleg stood in the hallway, staring at the wood. The silence returned. But in Oleg's mind, the silence was screaming. He had been dismissed. He had been mocked. And in his twisted logic, that mockery was the final confirmation. Only a guilty man would be so arrogant. He went back into his apartment. He locked the door. He looked at Raisa. He denied it. Oleg said quietly, "He laughed at me." "What do we do?" Raisa asked. Oleg looked at the Tokarev on the table. "We cannot let them transmit tonight. If the KGB won't come, we have to stop them ourselves." The purge was about to begin.